Cracks in the foundation. The mahogany desk in Judge Michael Lawson's chambers gleamed under the soft lighting as he reviewed the final documents for the Rivers versus Castellano case that would determine the fate of $3 billion. He was a man of principle, or so everyone believed. His silver hair and piercing blue eyes had become synonymous with justice in the federal courthouse for nearly 2 decades. Rachel, his wife of 15 years, sat across from him each evening, watching him prepare his arguments, and she had always felt proud of the man she married. But tonight, something was different. As Rachel entered their penthouse apartment overlooking the city, she felt the silence that had grown between them like a living, breathing thing. Michael had been distant for months, claiming the pressure of the case consumed him. She understood, or at least she tried to. She had become accustomed to his late nights and sudden trips, but her heart knew the truth even before her mind accepted it. Michael left his phone on the kitchen counter when he rushed to an evening conference call with his law clerks. Rachel had not intended to invade his privacy, but when it buzzed with a text from an unknown number, she felt compelled to check. The message was intimate, suggesting they meet at the Riverside Hotel where they always went. She knew that hotel. They had spent their honeymoon there. Her hands trembled as she opened his photo gallery, and there it was, the video that would change everything. Michael entangled with a woman she recognized immediately, Claire Montgomery, the socialite daughter of a wealthy family who frequented charity galas. Claire was younger than Rachel by 10 years, with a reputation for seduction and scandal. The video showed them in each other's arms in what appeared to be a luxury hotel room. The passion captured in those stolen moments felt like a knife through Rachel's heart. She watched the video 3 times, unable to stop herself, unable to believe that the man she had stood beside through his rise to prominence had betrayed her in such a cruel way. The words he spoke to Claire in that video were words he had not spoken to his wife in months. He called her beautiful and irresistible. His hand caressed her face with a tenderness that Rachel now realized had disappeared from their own intimate moments long ago. Rachel sat down on the cold tile floor of the kitchen and allowed herself to cry. She thought about their daughter Emma, away at university, who adored her father. She thought about the life they had built, the homes, the vacations, the carefully constructed image of perfection. They were the golden couple of the city. But that image was a lie, built on deception and betrayal. That night, as Michael came home, speaking about the Rivers case and asking her about her day, Rachel studied his face, looking for any sign of guilt, any hint of the man in that video. But he smiled at her with the same ease he always did, completely unaware that everything was about to fall apart. She realized that he had compartmentalized his life so completely that he could sit across from her and feel nothing. By dawn, Rachel had made her decision. She would not confront him, not yet. She would not play the role of the heartbroken wife begging for explanations. Instead, she would do what Michael had taught her to do through all his years in law. Use evidence, use strategy, use the power of truth as a weapon. She would expose him, not out of revenge, though that was certainly part of it, but because a man who could lie so effortlessly to his wife could certainly lie in court. She began to formulate a plan that would change all of their lives forever. Rachel spent the next 3 days in a state of controlled chaos. On the surface, she was the devoted wife, attending charity luncheons and maintaining appearances. But behind closed doors, she was downloading the video onto her laptop and researching journalists who covered high-profile stories. She knew she had to be careful. One wrong move, and the video could be traced back to her. Michael had taught her too much about the legal system for her to make amateur mistakes. She contacted a journalist named Thomas Bradford, who worked for the Metropolitan Tribune, a publication known for breaking scandals involving the city's elite. Rachel used a burner phone, purchased from a convenience store 3 towns over. She left no digital fingerprints, no email trails, nothing that could connect her to what was about to happen. Thomas agreed to meet her in a parking garage late at night, where Rachel handed him a flash drive containing not just the video, but also documentation of Michael's schedule and his movements with Claire. Thomas looked at the evidence spread across his car seat and let out a low whistle. "This is career-making," he said. "This is everything." But Rachel interrupted him coldly. "I don't care about your career. I care that people know what kind of judge sits on that bench." She paused and added, "Make it hurt. Make him understand what it feels like to have your world destroyed by someone you trusted. Make sure every person in this city knows exactly who he really is." The night before the final hearing in the Rivers case, the story dropped at 11:45 p.m. By midnight, it was trending nationwide. By 1 a.m., every news outlet was running the video and the accompanying article that detailed Michael's affair and the timeline of his betrayal. By 2 a.m., Thomas Bradford received a Journalism Award nomination just for the story. His phone exploded with calls from other journalists asking how he had obtained such explosive material. He kept his source confidential and built his entire career on the back of Michael Lawson's destruction. Rachel watched the news from her bedroom while Michael remained in his study, completely unaware. The headline screamed, "Federal judge embroiled in affair as billion-dollar ruling looms," and underneath was the video playing on repeat. Her hands shook as she saw her husband's face, pixelated but recognizable enough. His career was imploding in real time, and she felt nothing but cold satisfaction mixed with an unexpected wave of grief for the man she thought he was. At 3 a.m., Michael finally discovered the story. His phone began to ring incessantly. His legal team demanded he make a statement. His colleagues urged him to recuse himself from the case. But before any of that could happen, before the full weight of the scandal could crush him, Michael simply stared at the video on his screen and finally understood what his wife was capable of doing. He understood that Rachel Lawson was no longer a woman scorned. She was a woman at war, and she had annihilated him with surgical precision. Morning arrived like a thunderstorm. The courthouse steps were flooded with reporters, photographers, and television crews. Michael arrived with his collar turned up, his lawyer at his side, but there was no way to shield himself from the chaos that surrounded him. The scandal had already contaminated the Rivers case, and everyone knew it. Judge Michael Lawson was compromised, and the integrity he had spent 20 years building had crumbled to dust in a matter of hours. In the courtroom, Rachel sat in the gallery, her face perfectly composed. She wore a simple black dress, her wedding ring still gleaming on her finger. Some people looked at her with sympathy, others with suspicion. Everyone wondered if she had orchestrated this herself, and she let them wonder. The truth was complicated, and she was done explaining herself to anyone. She felt Alexander Rivers watching her from the defense table, understanding that she had essentially handed him the case on a silver platter. Michael looked exhausted, devastated, completely undone. His hands trembled as he took the bench. The courtroom fell silent, waiting to see what he would do. The weight of his humiliation was visible in every movement, every breath. The man who had commanded absolute respect now commanded only pity. Michael called for a recess. He could not proceed. Not like this. Not with the world watching and his personal disaster broadcast on every screen. His voice was hollow when he announced that he was recusing himself from the case. Another judge would be assigned, a fair judge, an uncompromised judge. Everything Michael had orchestrated, everything he had positioned himself to do, would now be decided by someone else, and the Rivers case would likely be thrown into complete chaos. But before he could leave the bench, he made the mistake of looking at Rachel. Their eyes met across the courtroom, and in that moment, something passed between them. Something that transcended anger and betrayal and revenge. Michael saw the woman he had broken, and Rachel saw the man she had destroyed. She had won her battle, but as she looked at his broken expression, she realized she was not sure what victory actually felt like. The satisfaction she had anticipated felt hollow, tainted by something darker. As she left the courthouse, Rachel received a call from her daughter, Emma, who had seen the news. Emma was crying, asking if it was true, if her father had really done this. Rachel had no answers for her daughter because she was too busy trying to understand what she had become. The woman who exposed the judge had also become something dark, something reactive, something she barely recognized in the mirror. Now they would all have to live with the consequences, and there was no way to undo what had been done. Michael Lawson became a ghost in his own life. Within 48 hours, he resigned from the bench. His law license was suspended pending investigation, and every major publication was dissecting not just his affair, but his entire judicial record. Questions arose about whether other cases had been influenced by his compromised judgment, whether his rulings had been bought or bartered, or simply tainted by his desire to impress a woman who meant nothing to him now. His enemies emerged from the shadows, demanding that his previous verdicts be reviewed. He moved out of the penthouse into a corporate apartment downtown, where he sat alone in unfurnished rooms, drinking bourbon and staring at news coverage of his own demise. The man who had commanded a courtroom with such authority now could not command anything. He had become irrelevant, a cautionary tale whispered in law schools and courthouse hallways. The Philadelphia Inquirer ran a piece about his downfall. The Washington Post called it the scandal that shattered judicial credibility. Cable news networks dissected every detail of his betrayal. His own family abandoned him. His parents refused to take his calls. His brother issued a statement distancing himself from Michael. His colleagues who had respected him now pretended he had never existed. One judge he had mentored years ago gave an interview to a news magazine suggesting that Michael's moral bankruptcy had probably always been beneath the surface, waiting to be exposed. His reputation was not merely damaged, it was obliterated. But the fallout extended beyond Michael. Rachel discovered that destroying her husband also meant destroying herself. The legal system she had relied on for protection now turned on her. When people discovered she had leaked the video, questions arose about her motives, her ethics, her integrity. The woman who had been sympathized with became suspected of orchestrating a conspiracy. Some called her brave, others called her vengeful. The truth was, she was both, and neither. Her lawyer warned her that Michael might file a countersuit, that he might claim entrapment or conspiracy or any number of legal accusations. Rachel realized too late that she had given her husband the perfect weapon against her. He could paint her as the villain, the calculating spouse who had orchestrated his downfall. She began receiving hate mail from people who believed she had gone too far, that a marriage should be handled privately, not broadcast to the entire nation. Emma refused to speak to her mother for weeks. After returning from university, she stayed at a friend's house rather than come home. Rachel found herself isolated from the social circles she had inhabited for 15 years. People who had been friends disappeared. Invitations ceased. The city that had embraced her now shunned her. She realized, in seeking justice, she had become just as guilty of betrayal as Michael had been, just as willing to sacrifice someone she loved for her own satisfaction. One afternoon, Rachel found herself standing outside Claire Montgomery's apartment building, not sure why she was there. Claire had also been affected by the scandal, though she bore a different kind of consequence. She had become infamous, notorious, the woman who seduced a judge. The media had turned her into a cautionary tale about the dangers of beauty without substance. Her family had disowned her, and she had been forced to leave the city. When Claire came out of the building, she almost collided with Rachel. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, two women caught in the wreckage of one man's infidelity. "I didn't know who you were when it started," Claire said quietly, her voice trembling. Her eyes were red from crying. "I never meant to cause this much pain. I was just a foolish girl playing with fire without understanding the burn." "That doesn't change anything," Rachel replied, but her voice had lost its anger. It had become something sadder, something more resigned. Claire nodded, understanding that there was no redemption here, no sisterhood between betrayed wife and mistress, only two women destroyed by the same man. "I lost my job, my family is barely speaking to me, and I have become exactly the kind of woman I swore I would never be," Claire continued. "And I suppose that makes us even," Rachel said, though they both knew that evening things never, that some wounds were too deep to ever fully heal. Claire walked away, and Rachel never saw her again.
That night, Rachel made a decision. She called her lawyer and instructed him to reach out to Michael. She would not seek revenge through the courts. She would not fight him for their possessions or their homes. The marriage was over, that much was clear. But she could stop the bleeding. She could stop the endless cycle of destruction. She could be the one to say enough.
6 months later, the city had moved on to other scandals, other drama, but Michael and Rachel remained suspended in the aftermath of their own implosion. Michael had enrolled in therapy, attempting to understand how he had become the kind of man capable of such profound deception. His therapist told him that accountability was the first step toward redemption, but redemption seemed like a foreign concept to someone who had spent his entire adult life believing he was above reproach. He began writing a book about his experience, not to excuse his actions, but to illustrate how privilege and power could corrupt even those who believed themselves incorruptible. It was a painful project, forcing him to examine every compromise, every rationalizing thought, every moment he had chosen his own desires over his integrity. The publisher warned him it would not sell well, that the public had no appetite for the reflections of a disgraced judge. But Michael no longer cared about commercial success. He cared only about facing himself in the mirror without flinching. He also reached out to several of the people whose cases he had ruled on during his years on the bench, people who wondered if his decisions had been tainted by his character flaws. He offered to support appeals and reviews. He could not undo the damage, but he could at least try to ensure that justice was served, even if it meant admitting his own culpability. Rachel, meanwhile, had discovered something unexpected in the wake of her revenge. She had become an advocate for transparency in the judiciary. She worked with ethics organizations and legal reform groups, using her platform as the woman who exposed the judge to push for real systemic change. She had transformed her pain into purpose, though she still struggled with the knowledge that her methods had been questionable, even if her cause had been righteous. She gave speeches at universities and legal conferences about the importance of judicial integrity and the dangers of unchecked power. She testified before legislative committees about reform measures that could prevent future scandals. She became a voice for change, and while some people criticized her methods, most recognized that her work was making a tangible difference in the legal system. Emma slowly began to rebuild her relationship with her mother, but the family dynamic had shifted irreversibly. There were no longer 3 of them, but rather 3 people learning to exist independently. Rachel had suggested family therapy, but Michael declined. He believed he had forfeited the right to call himself a family man. Emma visited her father occasionally, but their conversations were strained and careful, both of them grieving the family that had been destroyed. One evening, Rachel attended a lecture where Michael was speaking about judicial reform. To her surprise, he spoke not about his own downfall, but about the systemic issues that had enabled men like him to thrive for so long. He talked about the importance of accountability and the danger of unchecked power. He was different now, smaller somehow, but also more authentic than he had ever been. There was a humility in him that had never existed before. After the lecture, they spoke in the hallway for the first time since the scandal broke. "I heard about your work with the Ethics Commission," Michael said softly. "I am proud of you." Rachel looked at this man who had been her husband and realized she felt something unexpected. Not forgiveness exactly, but perhaps understanding. He had been broken down and forced to rebuild himself from scratch, and perhaps that was the closest he could come to redemption. They did not reconcile. They did not pretend the past had not happened, but they acknowledged that they had both been transformed by the destruction they had wrought. Michael returned to practicing law in a small firm, helping people who could not afford expensive representation. Rachel continued her advocacy work, knowing that while her methods had been questionable, the outcome had been real judicial reform. Years later, people still talked about the scandal that had rocked the federal courthouse, but the narrative had shifted. It was no longer just a story about betrayal. It had become a story about consequences, about the price of secrets, about what happens when power is finally held accountable. Both Michael and Rachel had paid that price in different ways, and while they would never be whole again, they had learned to live with their scars. Emma eventually became a lawyer herself. Driven by the complicated legacy of her parents, she specialized in judicial ethics and reform work, following in her mother's footsteps.
but taking a different path. She never spoke publicly about her family story, but everyone in legal circles knew who she was and understood the weight she carried. As Rachel looked out over the city from her office window, knowing that her work was making a difference, she understood that revenge and redemption were not opposites. They were two sides of the same coin. Both required a complete willingness to see oneself clearly, to accept the worst in oneself, and to attempt something better. She had started this journey seeking to destroy her husband, but in the end she had also destroyed and rebuilt herself. And perhaps that was the only real victory that mattered. She had exposed the truth. She had held power accountable. She had transformed her pain into something that helped others. But she had also lost her marriage, her family's innocence, and a part of herself that could never be recovered. The price of victory had been higher than she ever imagined, and even now, years later, she sometimes wondered if it had been worth it. But then she would remember a reform bill that passed because of her testimony, or a judge removed from office because of better ethics oversight. And she would know that despite everything, despite the cost, the work had mattered in ways that extended far beyond her own personal devastation.